In July 1938, a startling announcement rocked the city of Richmond, Virginia. The twin ray of Jesus Christ had been received in the form of a 2-month-old baby, and it was here to usher in a new golden age. The three people at the centre of the claim were devout disciples of Guy and Edna Ballard's I Am activity, a bizarre proto-new age movement that had stirred controversy and accusations of being a cult throughout the 1930s. Their claim of precipitating, or manifesting the twin ray, culminated in a disturbing all-night ritual, charges of insanity, a strange abduction, a court case, and an even deeper, more earthly mystery at the heart of it all. This is the story of the cult that manifested a baby. But before we begin to peel back the layers of intrigue and mystery, let me tell you about the sponsor of today's video, Aura. Now, I get a lot of spam phone calls, like a disturbing amount. And when I was researching the names of people involved in today's video, I couldn't believe just how much personal information is being sold by data brokers online. From names and telephone numbers to addresses and social media accounts. It's kind of terrifying out there, and a lot of it is being sold to scammers who will email or call you relentlessly until you feel like throwing your phone out the bloody window. That's where Aura comes in. They can show you exactly which data brokers are selling your information, and instead of having to contact them all yourself, they can send opt-out requests on your behalf, so no more scammers flooding your phone lines or your inbox. They also provide other features like antivirus, VPN, password management, parental control, and identity theft insurance. It's an all-in-one solution that can save you time, money, and hassle. And who doesn't want to save all three? You can try Aura for 2 whole weeks completely free. Just go to aura.com/weirdreads to start your free trial. And you'll also find the link down in the description. Our story begins at 100 North Boulevard in Richmond, Virginia, the home of Dr. Walter Lyles and his wife, Pearl Downs Lyles. Walter had graduated from the Medical College of Virginia, and he went on to be a successful dentist, running the business out of the family home. Pearl was the daughter of Charles Emmett Downs, a man known to eat and sleep politics, a master mason, member of the Knights Templar, and the chief clerk of the city and county section of the Virginia Comptroller's office. Not to get too bogged down in the details, but it's important to stress that these were wealthy and well-connected people living closely to Washington, D.C. The family had connections to Frank Buchman's anti-communist campaign for moral rearmament, described by Crypto Cuttlefish on Twitter as a Christian cult that emerged from the interwar New Age aristocratic scene. The Lyles' spiritual interests seem to have begun with Theosophy, the occult religion established by Elena Blavatsky in the late 1800s. They were members of the Richmond Theosophical Society, and the group held weekly meetings in their home in 1937. But at some point, the Lyles decided to sack off the secret doctrine and immerse themselves in the teachings of a theosophical offshoot group that called themselves the I Am activity. This religious movement recruited members from William Dudley Pelley's fascist silver shirts and took dictations from what they called the Ascended Masters, a sprawling list of deities from Jesus to Saint Germain. Their teachings were numerous, from the self-purifying violet flame that dissolved all imperfection, to the concept of twin rays, the dawning of a golden age of civilization in the United States, and the shunning of traditional medical care. For a more in-depth look at the Ballards, their belief system, their run-ins with the law, and their influence on the New Age, I recommend watching my video, The Cult of I Am, where I refer to them as a New Age Christian esoteric Tony Robbins style positive thinking cult with a heavy dose of fascism thrown in for good measure. The Lyles were, by all accounts, devoted followers of Guy and Edna's teachings. The meeting room formerly used for the Theosophical Society was turned into a makeshift chapel, complete with a pulpit, and the home became a hub of activity for local I-Amers, or, as they're sometimes affectionately called, Yammers or Yams. Portraits of Ascended Master Saint Germain adorned the walls, along with a large depiction of the mighty I-Am presence. To give you an idea of just how dedicated they were, that large depiction would have set them back around $200 in 1938, which is around $4,400 today, which is It's funny because when you type in the I am activity on Google, you'll be presented with their Wikipedia page and a quote that claims that the group aren't involved in financial schemes. Good old reliable Wikipedia, eh? In 1937, the Lyells placed a want ad in the local paper, and it was this ad that supposedly caught the attention of a Mrs. Lucille Silver. If we just go by the press reports of the time, then little was known about Lucille's early life. She claimed to have been born on March 30th, 1907 in Bedford County, Virginia. She supposedly grew up in an orphanage before eventually getting married, presumably to a Mr. Silver. She'd had a child with her husband and then he passed away, and Lucille was understandably devastated. She attempted to take her own life but claimed that a voice intervened. From that point onwards, she said she dedicated her life to Jesus. Lucille answered the Lyells want ad and got the position, although it's unclear just what that position was. Working in the family home, one has to presume that Lucille was privy to the makeshift chapel and the comings and goings of local I amers. Although the circumstances are unclear, Lucille eventually attended one of the meetings and quickly converted. After doing so, she allegedly had visions and even began communicating with beloved Nada, one of Guy Ballard's ascended masters, who had supposedly raised her body 2,700 years ago and who does a very transcendent work for the humanity of this earth. That's according to the I amers. Personally, I never heard of her. After suffering with stomach aches and an assortment of other symptoms, Lucille was taken to a doctor in March 1938. She was told that several feet of her intestines were in a very bad condition and she would have to undergo an operation. Intestinal surgery requires the use of an anaesthetic, but according to Lucille, Saint Germain was adamant that she have none, and she claims that she had these bad intestines removed without the use of any sedative or anaesthetic whatsoever. It sounds hard to believe, and it's important to remember that these are claims that Lucille made herself, and there's a serious lack of corroborating evidence. Soon after her surgery, Lucille travelled with Walter and Pearl to Washington, D.C. to hear Guy Ballard speak in the flesh. According to their magazine, The Voice of I Am, the Ballards were in Washington, D.C. from the 9th to the 17th of April 1938, speaking at the Rialto Auditorium. It was here that Edna Ballard is alleged to have told Lucille not to wear any red or black clothes, a bizarre teaching that was supposedly handed down by Saint Germain himself. See, old Saint Germain hated the colour red. That was the colour of communism, and Germain was a vehement anti-communist. He even proclaimed that one day the red in the United States flag would be replaced with gold. Guy and Edna taught that all red on this planet is a record of impurity, and when that impurity is removed, the colour instantly becomes gold. And they even claimed that when their followers ascended, all the blood in their bodies would become liquid gold light. Part of me wonders if Lucille had showed up to the event wearing red. If she had, then I'm sure that Edna would have clocked her and immediately pulled her aside to lecture her about the strict colour code. Kind of like that bit in Serial Mum where Kathleen Turner lectures Patty Hearst about wearing white after Labour Day.
You can't wear white shoes after Labor Day.
That's not true anymore.
Yes, it is. Didn't your mother ever tell you?
Thankfully, Edna didn't beat her to death with a telephone. Now remember, Lucille is supposedly having her own spiritual communication, and she claimed to have later heard a voice confirming this oddly specific dress code. After these higher powers solidified Edna's request, she decided to get rid of all of her red and black clothes, and was seemingly quickly rewarded. That afternoon, the doorbell rang. As I opened the door, I was handed a package. I immediately opened it and found a gorgeous blue evening gown. This was just the beginning of what Lucille claimed was a series of precipitations, and we're not talking about the weather. From my understanding, the concept of precipitation, as it pertains to the I Am teachings, is almost a form of manifestation. The Church Universal and Triumphant, themselves a modern offshoot of the I Am activity, define precipitation as the alchemical process of drawing forth cosmic light and substance from the universal substance and coalescing it into physical form, often by by using the science of the spoken word. The Ballards claimed that this power of precipitation was the perfect means of supplying all that is required. They would use it to manifest an overwhelming supply of wealth, money, and blessings. And for Lucille, it seemed to be a cosmic blank check that she could cash whenever she wanted. There were more fancy evening gowns, gold slippers, elaborate jewellery, and flowers for her hair. They all arrived via this power of precipitation. And there were supposedly witnesses to all of this as well. Lucille also worked in the house of a Mrs. Marcia S. Clemmer, another local Iama, and a friend of the Lyles. She claimed that she had witnessed examples of precipitations of fine things for Mrs. Silver, and some items had even appeared in her home when Mrs. Silver wasn't there. Now, a skeptic would say that someone, be it Lucille, the Lyles, or even the Ballards themselves, must have been sending the items. These things don't just appear out of thin air, no matter how ferociously you chant. But if you thought that the precipitation of clothes and accessories was a bit far-fetched, you might want to strap yourself in for this next bit. According to Lucille, July 10th was an ordinary summer afternoon. She was sitting on a bench in the local park when she heard footsteps. It sounded like someone was walking towards her, but there was nobody there that she could actually see. She claimed to have felt an invisible presence sit down beside her. So naturally, she was like, who the heck are you? But whoever it was just left her hanging. Now, if this was me, I would have gotten straight out of there. I would have sensed the bad vibes. I would have been off. But Lucille stayed. Remember, she's heard voices before, ones that she claimed had saved her life. Luckily, her curiosity soon paid off. For an hour later, she finally heard the voice. The seemingly shy spirit had decided to talk, and it sounded remarkably similar to the voice that she'd heard before. I shall bring forth a baby girl, and you shall shield it with your life. Be not afraid, for the light shall blaze over Richmond. The way Lucille describes hearing this voice is almost as if it's coming from inside her, a form of spiritual guidance, if you will. She was clearly shaken. It's one thing to feel a presence next to you, and another thing entirely to actually hear it. So she races back to the Lyles house and she tells them exactly what happened. Given the family's commitment to the I Am teachings, it's likely that they believed Lucille had had a spiritual experience, especially given her prior communion with this discarnate voice and her so-called talent for precipitation. At 6 a.m. the next morning, Lucille claimed that she was woken up by her covers being pulled off her bed. When she looked around for the culprit, she found her room completely empty, but it wasn't long before she heard that same voice, this time giving her a direct instruction. Arise, get the Chamberlain Avenue bus and ride to the end of the line. Wait there for me. This disincarnate voice is seemingly all-knowing, especially when it comes to the local bus routes. It can communicate telepathically and give clear instructions. It can supposedly bring forth a child from God knows where to give to Lucille, but apparently it can't just leave the child on her doorstep. It's going to make her jump for a few hoops first. She's got to get her ass out of bed and meet whoever the hell this is at the end of the line. Lucille wasn't about to argue. She was just like, all right, Chamberlain Avenue, I'm on my way. She said that it was an awfully warm day. She was nervous as anything, and she was sweating buckets. And I mean, wouldn't you be if a spirit was about to give you a child? She rode the bus to the end of the line, got off and waited for hours. It seemed like nobody was going to show up. And by the time midday rolled around, she'd just about had enough of waiting. She was ready to pack it all up and go home. But then, in the distance, she spotted a small woman walking in her direction. She was alone and carried no packages. In fact, she seemed just an ordinary woman taking a walk. She was bareheaded, wore long hair well done up, dressed in a purple dress with several different kinds of little flowers in it. She was very beautiful and seemed radiantly happy. She walked past me. Then suddenly she stopped and turning to me, she stretched forth her two hands. And right there before my eyes, I saw the sweetest, most beautiful little baby, precipitated fully clad in precious, most suitable baby clothes. Lucille claimed that when this woman handed her the baby, a charge of electricity passed between them. She said it was like sticking your finger in an electric light socket. The woman told told her to call the child Barbara May and told Lucille that we will watch over her and she shall not want for anything. She was told that the baby was 2 months old, given 2 bottles of milk and strict feeding instructions. As Lucille looked up from the precious bundle in her arms, the woman, whoever she was, had disappeared. Within a split second, a taxi cab appeared, unlike any that Lucille had ever seen before, although she never really elaborated on what made it appear so strange. Trusting that she was being divinely guided, Lucille and the baby got inside the cab, and soon she was being dropped off in front of the Lyles home. She got out of the cab and started to rummage around in her purse for money, but the car just sped off. She claimed to have zero recollection of what the driver looked like, but clearly he wasn't concerned with earthly matters like money. Arriving back home with the baby in her arms, Lucille recounted the strange story to Walter and Pearl, who were unsurprisingly hooked from the start. I mean, she's got a baby, for God's sake. The proof of the story is right there. Lucille initially called the woman that she had met the Lady Master from the cosmic spheres, but would go on to proclaim that she was the Blessed Mother Mary. Yes, that Mary. See, the baby wasn't just any old baby. It was the twin ray of Jesus Christ, and she was given to Lucille for a purpose. According to Dr. Lyles,
This baby is a sign of the coming of the golden age. Wars will cease, but those who do not cease their quarreling and discord will be destroyed. There will be a great catastrophe in a few weeks if people do not stop their discord. The gas belts under the earth will explode and cause earthquakes and unknown destruction.
For those familiar with the Ascended Master teachings of Guy and Edna Ballard, these doomsday-esque predictions won't sound surprising. Throughout the late 1930s, the Ballards continually warned their followers about gas belts lurking underneath cities. They claimed that it was these belts that were responsible for earthquakes. Gerald Bryan writes in his book, Psychic Dictatorship in America, that many of the susceptible ones in these cities became extremely jittery over the gas belts under their feet and joined the cult to protect themselves, for only the Ballard decrees could save these cities from utter destruction. Alongside the doomsday predictions, the future of the United States seemed to be of great importance to Ascended Master Saint Germain. From his first meeting with Guy Ballard on Mount Shasta, he'd made it clear that the US would be the country to usher in a new golden age, although he'd never made mention of a baby. By all accounts, Lucille and the Lyles truly believed that they had received the twin ray of Jesus. But it's not like they could just rock up to City Hall and tell him that. Instead, they decided to keep the finer details to themselves, telling the authorities that someone had felt extra generous and was like, here you go, have a baby. Which, despite it technically being true, was missing some important details. Keeping the truth hidden was eating Walter Lyles up inside, so he decided to put in a long-distance call to Los Angeles and the one man that would know exactly what to do. No official record exists of the telephone conversation between Walter Lyles and Guy Ballard, but Walter claimed that Guy told him to tell the story just as it happened. It was this advice that led Lucille and the Lyles directly to the local press, and eventually their downfall. On Sunday the 17th of July, just 6 days after Lucille received the baby, they decided to establish its divinity by issuing a statement to the Richmond Times-Dispatch. The article ran the next day on page 3, under the headline, Jesus twin is given here, says woman. They included a grainy black and white photograph of Lucille holding the baby, flanked on either side by Pearl and Walter. Walter made several grandiose claims throughout the article. I mean, he is proclaiming a child to be the twin ray of Jesus, for God's sake. Why stop there? Apparently, he, Pearl and Lucille were reincarnations of friends of Jesus Christ, and it was because of this that they were chosen to receive the twin ray. It kind of reminds me of the life readings that Edgar Cayce was famous for. You know, the ones where he claimed that him, his wife, and his much younger stenographer were all connected to each other in their past lives, and that they were basically destined to be a throuple. Although I don't think that Walter was trying to start an I am flavoured polycule. Maybe he was, who bloody knows. Another of Walter's strange claims was that a light with a glow that resembled lightning shone over their home all Sunday night. Remember, the voice that originally spoke to Lucille in the park told of a light that would blaze over all of Richmond. It's a very obvious reference to the Star of Bethlehem, and Walter also explained that they had received many telephone calls and several gifts for the baby. Wise men had been showing up non-stop with bags full of gold, frankincense and myrrh. I'm just kidding, but he might as well have said that because this is just a repurposed nativity story for the late 1930s.
I got to this point in editing and realised that I hadn't actually explained what a twin ray is, so here's a quick rundown. The I Am activity taught that cosmic beings originated from the great central sun. They're made of a substance that looks like white fire, and from this fire, two rays are projected. Within each is what they call an electronic body. One is masculine and one is feminine. Essentially, a twin ray is your spiritual other half. So yes, they are claiming that this baby is the spiritual soulmate of Jesus. Not at all sus.
People wanted to see this baby, and who can blame them? I mean, it's not every day you get the opportunity to share the same space as the twin ray of Jesus. The only problem was that despite only being 2 months old, this baby was very particular about the vibes. Apparently she's an empath and she can't stand being in the presence of people not in harmony with her energy. In a scene oddly reminiscent of the time Michael Jackson revealed his baby blanket to the world, Lucille and the Lyles would stand on the second floor balcony while onlookers gathered in the garden below to catch a glimpse of this special child. For a brief moment in time, they were on top of the world. They could seemingly manifest anything they wanted, and it appeared that they had been divinely chosen to raise the twin ray of Jesus. The only problem was, it was all a complete lie. It didn't take long for cracks to appear in Lucille and the Lyles story. In fact, they began to show the day after making their announcement. All the publicity had caught the attention of Jacob Umlauf, the superintendent of the city home, and he immediately went to the press with an alternative story. According to him, on July 4th, a woman named Mrs. Garrett E. Van Meter of Riverside Drive in Washington arrived at the city home to try and adopt a baby. She solicited several women before finding one that supposedly agreed to the adoption. Back in the 1930s, laws around adoption were still sorely lacking, but I'm not entirely sure how easy it would have been for Lucille to just walk into the city home and adopt a child. It's more likely that this was a private adoption, and there was probably money involved. Raising a child is a massive financial commitment, and this is all happening during the Great Depression. I wouldn't be surprised if she went to the city home looking for a mother that would accept cash in return for their child. It also reminds me of the case of James Schaefer and baby Jean, which I covered in a previous video. That case happened 1 year after this one, and Schaefer arguably preyed on a working class mother who desperately needed money, convincing her to give up her child. It also just makes me wonder why all of these bizarre esoteric spiritual groups are obsessed with children. It's all just a little bit weird. Anyway, moving on, the local news began work on trying to track down whoever Mrs. Garrett E. Van Meter was. She could be the key to solving this entire bizarre mystery. Now remember, back in the 1930s, women tended to lose their right to a first name, so Garrett would have been the name of Mrs. Van Meter's husband, and they quickly found her husband after perusing the Washington telephone directory. When they called him up, he categorically denied everything. Not only had he never been to Richmond or had any involvement with the I Am activity, but he also denied even having a wife. He declared that imposters had been using his name, and the local press seemed to take him at his word. But more on that a little later. Lucille and the Lyles were less than happy with this turn of events. Suddenly their story was being called into question, and they were being grilled as if they were liars. But the disembodied voice had seemingly prepared Lucille for naysayers and skeptics. She claimed that she had been told that hundreds of people would try to take the baby away from her, but she defied any of them to take it, and for anyone to prove that it was theirs. Walter followed suit, declaring that he would give all of his property to anyone that could bring forth the child's mother or father and prove that the baby wasn't the twin ray of Jesus. The Richmond Times-Dispatch claimed that while they were present at the Lyles home, they saw Lucille chanting over the baby, "Almighty One, annihilate them. They shall not take my child away." If you're familiar with any of the I Am decrees or affirmations, then you'll be well acquainted with talk of annihilation. Guy Ballard taught that fear and doubt are the two robbers of humanity's happiness. He told the I Amers to use the violet consuming flame to annihilate once and for all eternity everything in human consciousness that attempts to limit or dominate you longer by the suggestion of fear and doubt. Lucille was clearly trying to connect to her I Am presence by chanting over the child. To an outsider, this must have seemed a little odd, but it appears that Lucille truly believed that she could call forth the protection of the violet flame to ensure that she kept hold of the baby and put all of this hearsay to bed. But unfortunately, the violet flame is nothing compared to the ferocious appetite of the local press once they get whiff of a juicy story. Just 2 days after the original article, Lucille and the Lyles suffered another almighty blow to their claims of a magically appearing baby. The Times-Dispatch reported on 2 women, Mrs. Harold Chase and Mrs. Kate Ketchum, who claimed to have looked after the child between July 4th and July 11th. They said that Lucille had boarded with them last winter, when she had first come to Richmond. Apparently, Lucille had previously been involved in evangelical work in Washington, D.C. under the name Sister Lucille Leslie. On the morning of July 4th, Mrs. Chase arrived home to find Lucille on her doorstep with a baby in her arms. She needed a place to keep the child and even offered to pay Mrs. Chase to look after it.
Well, she said it was really 5 months old, but that it looked as if it were only 2 months old. She explained that its skin was dark because it had been kept in an incubator and given sun baths and had acquired a tan.
Lucille appeared to be smitten with the child. She would visit with her almost every day, bringing her clothes and other gifts.
Lucille must really love that baby. She would grab it and hold it close to her and almost cry whenever we asked her about it. She seemed afraid that somebody would take it away. She's always been crazy about babies, and she worships that one.
The baby stayed with Mrs. Chase until the morning of July 11th, when Lucille arrived and claimed that she wanted to take the baby to the Lyles home, where it was to be dedicated to the Lord. She asked Mrs. Chase to prepare 2 bottles of milk and supposedly left via a taxi cab that she had called herself. Now, this story is a far cry from hearing voices, meeting Mother Mary at the end of the bus line, being given the twin ray of Jesus, and then being whisked away in a magical taxi like she's Bill Murray in Scrooge.
Whoa! Hey,
Mrs. Chase is really throwing a spanner in the works here, and I don't think that even the violet flame can protect Lucille from this one. The allegations of a stolen baby soon captured the attention of local law enforcement. Detective Lieutenant Dan Dulling was assigned to investigate the case, and one of the first things he did was take Lucille back to the city home. He needed to find out whether anyone there recognised her, and whether or not she had actually used a fake name to secure the child. Lo and behold, 2 nurses at the home recognised her as the woman who, under the name Mrs. Van Meter, had shown up with the intention of adopting a child. Now, bear in mind, all of this is unravelled over the course of like 3 days. Sunday night, they go to the press with the twin ray story. Monday, it's published. Tuesday, we get the superintendent throwing doubt on the story. Wednesday, we get Mrs. Harold Chase. And now, on Thursday, Lucille has been unmasked as the woman at the city home. With this revelation, the baby was promptly removed from Lucille's care and returned to the city home, with the city judge declaring that Lucille had no fixed home or employment, and as such, it wouldn't be in the child's best interest to have her adopt it. Unsurprisingly, the stress would have been a lot to deal with. I mean, at this point, they've well and truly been rumbled, but believe it or not, things are about to get even worse. At 7:15 a.m. on the morning of Saturday, the 23rd of July, police officers L.H. Griffin and J.A. Smith received a call on their radio to respond to a domestic disturbance at the Lyles home. The caller was none other than Lucille, pleading for some kind of help. When the officers arrived on the scene, they found Lucille in the garden, surrounded by clothing, toys, bed sheets, dental apparatus, and other objects that appeared to have been thrown from the second floor of the house. Lucille was frantic. She claimed that the Lyles had been dousing both her and their 3 biological children in a cold tub of water throughout the night. The Times-Dispatch reported that although the officers could hear sounds of singing coming from the second floor of the home, there appeared to be not enough evidence of disorderly conduct to justify the police invading the home. Now, this contradicts a statement that the officers later made where they claimed that the place was in uproar and that the backyard was a site. It almost sounds as if they're reluctant to believe Lucille. The fake twin ray of Jesus story has been the talk of the town all week. They may have believed Lucille herself to be responsible. So she decided to change tact and asked the officers to fetch Pearl's father, Charles Emmett Downs. The officers seemed to follow her instruction and soon brought him back to the Lyles home. Presumably, Lucille stayed outside while they entered the house. Officer Griffin said that they found Walter, Pearl and their 3 children in the I Am meeting room on the second floor of the house, and the scene was definitely raucous. The floor itself was covered with water and it had begun to drip through the ceiling below. They said that one of the Lyles children was nude while the others were in states of partial undress. They appeared to be damp, terrified, and they're reported as crying. Walter and Mrs. Lyles were barefoot and damp themselves, and in the nearby bathroom, the police found a tub filled to the brim and overflowing with water. It seemed to corroborate Lucille's story. The Lyles were unhinged and they appeared to still be in the throes of some kind of episode. The officers reported that Pearl told Walter to not say a word, and then she told him to close his eyes, followed by another command. He did as he was told, and the officers claimed that he began to fall to the ground. They had to step in to stop him from hurting himself, eventually laying him on a nearby daybed. As for Pearl, she seemed determined to involve the police officers in her peculiar ritual. She apparently even told them to get into the cold bath, and they were like, do you know what, Pearl? I think I'm alright, cheers, love. She did insist on dousing them with some of the water that was accumulating on the floor of the meeting room, rubbing it on their hands and foreheads, while she made unusual hand signs and muttered under her breath. Reading the news report, it sounds like a description of a woman in the throes of religious psychosis. Soon after dousing the police officers, Pearl started singing and playing I Am music on the piano. She claimed to have sung a song called I Will Send a Golden Ray Out to All of the World Today. And I'm not sure if this was an officially sanctioned I Am song or one that she'd made up herself. All of the music created by Guy and Edna Ballard was supposedly charged with powerful healing and special activity, so it's possible that Pearl thought that the music would protect her. Apparently, Walter declared that he would tell the officers what was going on, only to change his mind and say, no, actually, I'll tell you later. What a tease. According to the Times-Dispatch, he fell into silence and only broke it by commenting about how his necktie was missing. Talk about getting your priorities straight, Walter. He's soaking wet, he's got cops all throughout his house, and he's worried about his necktie. The police even claimed that Pearl tried to dunk the children in the bathtub while they were there, but they somehow managed to talk her out of it. Now, all of this appears to confirm everything that Lucille had told the police originally. According to her, Pearl and Walter had dunked her in the tub repeatedly throughout the night. They would then dunk the children and force them to sing and chant decrees. Pearl's father was obviously concerned. The Downs were supposed to be a well-to-do Virginia family. They ran in the upper echelons of society and politics. And here was his daughter and her husband bringing their family name into disrepute. So he did what any loving parent would do. He got all 3 of them arrested.
I'm stuck here on the inside looking out. I'm just another case.
Lucille, Walter and Pearl were all charged with being persons suspected of being of unsound mind. In other words, they were all off their bloody rocker. However, Lucille being arrested does strike me as being a little bit unfair. If her account is to be believed, then she's a victim of the Lyles. In the newspaper accounts at the time, it says that all 3 of them were held without bond, but it also says that Walter and Pearl were placed into the custody of relatives that same Saturday evening. A news report report from the following Monday shows that at some point over the weekend, the Lyles were placed in the local Tucker sanitarium, while Lucille was left to languish in a city jail. Remember, the Lyles are affluent and well connected, and as such, they can afford access to some form of psychiatric care, while Lucille, who called the police in the first place, is pretty much left to fend for herself. But I'm sure that the Lyles would have had no problem with this double standard. While I was researching them, I discovered that Walter had given a talk in 1935 about how healthcare was not a birthright, and he also wrote a lovely piece in the Proceedings of the North Carolina Dental Society in 1926, where he said,
I wish that there might be some form of legislation to control marriages among the inferior classes. I do not believe that deformed or diseased people should be allowed to reproduce. The inferior classes seem to delight most in reproduction, but the future of a nation should not be menaced by the will of degenerates.
Why am I just not surprised at all that he was a eugenicist? Also, dentist watch. That's all I'm saying. I bring this up because Walter and Pearl Lyles were both in a significant position of power and privilege over Lucille. Arguably, the Lyles' faith in the I Am teachings is what got her to convert, and that led to the whole baby debacle in the first place. At the beginning of August, a lunacy commission was formed to judge whether or not Dr. Walter Lyles was of sound mind. It consisted of 3 people: Squire Atkinson, Dr. James Asser Shield, and Dr. Rex Blankenship, and all 3 of them pronounced him sane. As such, he was promptly released. As for Pearl and Lucille, Dr. Shield claimed that it was best to keep the 2 women under observation for a little longer before making a final decision. This just speaks volumes. We know that women have been unfairly treated in healthcare settings since time immemorial, and here's Walter Lyles immediately being judged sane, while the 2 women involved in the same case supposedly need extra observation. And before you will start jumping on me in the comments and accuse me of being too political, may I remind you that it was Walter that believed the baby was going to stop wars, that it was heralding a coming golden age, that him, Lucille and Pearl were reincarnations of Jesus's mates, and that something akin to the Star of Bethlehem had shone over his home. But anyway, I'm not going to belabor the point. This entire debacle was too much even for the most hardened I Am followers. These 3 people had brought the entire practice into disrepute, and by mid-August, the I Amers decided to release a series of statements. In their Voice of I Am magazine, they wrote,
Do not believe the claims of vicious individuals and impostors who claim the precipitation of babies or children. The ascended masters do not teach such deception, and such reports are deliberate falsehoods.
On August 10th, Paul Hartman Stickle, a national I Am exponent and former member of the executive committee of the Friends of New Germany, gave a statement to the press repudiating Lucille.
She apparently knows nothing about the I Am teachings. She let her mind wander over something that she did not understand.
So it's perfectly acceptable to be part of an explicitly pro-Nazi organisation, but proclaiming a baby to be the twin ray of Jesus is a step too far. Just 4 years later, Paul would be indicted for mail fraud, along with Edna Ballard and numerous other I Am followers. He was eventually acquitted and seemed to follow the teachings for the rest of his life. According to him, the Lyles had been influenced by Lucille. She was the one responsible for this entire debacle. Whether or not the plan to adopt the baby was a joint venture, or one planned entirely by Lucille, is up for debate. But it's important to remember that the Lyles were the ones that introduced her to the I Am teachings, and they were the ones who, under the advice of Guy Ballard, went to the press. It makes sense that the I Am exponents would throw Lucille under the bus. The Lyles were well off. They could afford magazines, artwork, tapes and lectures. They were cash cows and they needed to be protected. At some point in August or September, Lucille and Pearl were finally released, although there's zero record of it in any of the local newspapers. It's almost as if the press forgot about the story and moved on to something new. Either that or Pearl's father managed to keep her name out of the papers. But what of Lucille? You'd think that there would be some interest in her release. and perhaps a follow-up, but we get nothing. That is, until the 1st of December, when an incredibly strange story appears in the Richmond Times-Dispatch.
Mrs. Lucille Silver of the 2700 block, West Gray Street, was found last night in a semi-conscious condition in a field in the rear of the first block, South Robinson Street. Police said her mouth was gagged with her own handkerchief and that a rope was around her neck. She told officers that 2 men had forced her into an automobile near her home and, after riding around for some time, had thrown her into the field. She was taken to Memorial Hospital, where attendants said her only injuries were bruises to her legs.
A strange and disturbing turn of events. Was this a random attack, or was someone trying to threaten Lucille? Silence her, perhaps? And if they were, what was the motive? On the 15th of December 1938, just under 5 months after the twin ray baby debacle, Lucille filed lawsuits against Dr. Walter Lyles and Colonel C. Emmett Downs, Pearl's father, each of them for $25,000 in damages, which is about $500,000 in today's money. She was not messing around. She filed these lawsuits through her attorney, a man named Thomas H. Stone, charging them both with assault and battery and accusing Downs of using insulting words. It all related back to that fateful evening in July, where all 3 of them were arrested, and it appeared that Lucille was ready to share her side of the story. She claimed that Walter and Pearl had forcibly removed her clothing and dunked her in the tub of freezing cold water multiple times. When she tried to fight back and defend herself, she claimed that Walter had placed a towel in her mouth to stop her from speaking, effectively gagging her. Pearl allegedly grabbed her by the hair, and both of them placed her over 2 chairs, proceeding to strike her over the back. Lucille claimed that these beatings and dunkings continued throughout the evening, only ever pausing for the Lyles to pray or chant "I am decrees." When it came to Colonel Downs, she claimed that after she had finally called the police, Downs shook her maliciously and violently and told her,
"You are the cause of this, and I am going to ship you away for the rest of your life. I'll take care of my daughter, but you are going to the crazy house. You are crazy."
He sounds like a lovely bloke, doesn't he? The case was due to be heard in court in December, but it had to be postponed until January because of Lucille's injuries from her abduction. Was it possible that someone knew she was planning on filing a damages lawsuit and they were trying to silence her? Was it a completely unrelated incident? Or could there be a stranger explanation? On the 20th of January 1939, the damages trial against Walter Lyles commenced, watched over by Judge Ernest Wells in the Richmond Hustings Court. The first witness called to the stand was Pearl Lyles, and unsurprisingly, she gave a completely different account of the events of that fateful July evening than both Lucille, the police, and the local press. According to her, Lucille had become violent and mentally unstable shortly after dinner. She claimed that she had suddenly gone into an unexplainable fit of rage, screaming "I hate you" repeatedly, as well as striking Pearl. They filled the tub with cold water because they believed it would soothe her, that somehow the shock of the cold would jolt her out of this violent disposition. She said that Lucille got in voluntarily, which is strange because if she's so violent and out of control, why would she submit to being dunked in cold water? She then said that they finally got her calm. They undressed her and then put her to bed, hoping that that would be the end of it. But it wasn't, because Lucille then supposedly rushed into their bedroom, tearing at her hair and screaming that she was crazy and that she hated them. So again, they decided to dunk her in the cold water and put her to bed after, because it worked so well the first time. It's an account that possibly explains why the bathtub was filled with water and why it was splashed all over the floor, but it doesn't account for some of the other strange things that were mentioned in the original press reports. Remember, Lucille called the police and was found outside the property in the garden, surrounded by linens, dental equipment, and God knows what else. Pearl had a bizarre explanation for that. Apparently, she had just decided to wake up and throw some blankets into the backyard for their janitor to pick up later on and wash. She also decided to start having a clear out of things that they no longer wanted. I don't know about you, but I find it a little hard to believe. And what about the children? Remember, in the original report, they're described as being in states of undress. They were wet, crying, and appeared to be terrified. Pearl outright denied that they had dunked the children at all, which I find incredibly hard to believe. In the original newspaper reports, the police claimed that she was still trying to dunk the children while they were there. She also denied dousing the police officers in water and said that the only reason she started singing I Am songs on the piano was to calm the children. Now, I'm not saying that Lucille's version of events is the whole truth. As we'll come to find out, she's a bit of a mystery herself, but I certainly don't buy Pearl's denial of the entire affair as some big misunderstanding. It's also important to note that the arresting officers from that incident never took to the stand to corroborate their own police report. Surely if Pearl is putting forward this alternate reading of what these police officers experienced, they should have been called for questioning. At this point, it's important to reiterate that Pearl's father was incredibly well connected. He was a high-level Freemason, a member of the Knights Templar, and he associated with a myriad of politicians, businessmen, and lobbyists in Washington, D.C. And to be clear, I'm not insinuating any kind of grand conspiracy, but this is a man that knew people that could do him favours. He was well connected, and that gives him immense power. It's entirely possible that he would have been able to pull some strings behind the scenes and stop the police officers from appearing in court. But I can't prove any of that, and I can't tell you exactly why they didn't appear, so it is just a theory. Unfortunately, I'm relying on old newspaper articles, and the journalists at the time didn't seem that interested in the finer details. I have put in a Freedom of Information Act request for some of these details, and I'm hoping that at some point I'll be able to uncover more. Dr. DeJarnette, the superintendent of the Southwestern State Hospital, a mental health facility in Virginia, was also called to the stand, and he revealed some information that cast even more doubt and suspicion over Lucille. He testified that she had been a patient since 1927, when she had been committed with auditory hallucinosis. I managed to verify this by checking the census for 1930, and she was indeed listed as an inmate at the facility. In typical 1930s style, the doctor described Lucille as hysterical and claimed that she was highly religious and would sometimes be led astray, then she'd go wild. Dr. Asa Shields, who examined Lucille after the arrest, testified that she wasn't entirely insane, but still not entirely a normal person. Despite not bringing in the original arresting officers, the defence did manage to call on the two detective sergeants that had investigated Lucille's bizarre abduction by two men that left her with a rope around her neck. Sergeant Kellum said that from our investigation, it looked like she tied herself up and laid there on the ground. This became a large part of the defence's argument against Lucille. According to Kellum, the person that found her reported that her mouth was full of sausage, and the defense claimed that Lucille had used this sausage to put bloodstains on the handkerchief in her mouth and also on her clothes. Lucille clapped back and said it was ridiculous that you can't get blood out of a sausage. The defense were clearly trying to discredit Lucille by any means necessary. She was a liar. She wasn't sane. She wasn't to be trusted. She did seem to have one person on her side, Mrs. Mabel Virginia Sykes, a religious woman who would visit the local jail and spread the good word. That's where the two had first met. Mabel let Lucille stay with her when she was released, and she backed up the abduction story, claiming that the household had been receiving threatening telephone calls from anonymous people in the days and weeks leading up to her kidnapping. When Lucille took to the stand herself, she admitted that the baby had been found in the city home, but she said that Walter Lyles was the originator of the whole story. I didn't even know what a twin ray meant until the reporter came into the house and
Dr. Lyles explained it to the reporter.
She denied that she believed in the possibility of babies and material possessions being precipitated, but stated that she did believe that there is nothing impossible in God. Her story was somewhat corroborated by James Latimer, a reporter for the Richmond Times-Dispatch, who testified that Walter had handed him a typewritten statement titled A Partial Biography of Lucille Silver, which detailed the events of her life right up to receiving the miracle child. We know that the Lyles were much more well-read when it came to both theosophical concepts and those of the I Am Ascended Master teachings, and that these were most likely passed on to Lucille. I Am was very much pay to play, and the Lyles were the ones with all the cash. I don't find it hard to believe that Walter came up with the entire story, although that doesn't mean that Lucille herself wasn't involved in any of it. She was the one that went and got the baby in the first place. But none of these discrepancies really seemed to matter to the jury. They ended up deliberating for 30 minutes before ruling in favour of the defendants. The judge declared,
The jury's verdict meets with my approval absolutely. In my opinion, it is the only verdict they could have returned. If they had brought in a verdict against the defendant, I would have set it aside.
The same judge then dismissed Lucille's lawsuit against Colonel Downs on the grounds that she was incompetent to sue. And that was where the trail of newspaper articles about this case ended. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to know, especially when it came to Lucille. Was she a liar? Did she really use a fake name to adopt a child? Where was Mr. Silver while all of this was happening? And what of her abduction? Was she really threatened, or did she manage to fake it? There were just so many unanswered questions, so I decided to carry on digging. I want to preface the following information by saying that I'm not a doctor, nor am I a psychologist. I'm simply a researcher who stumbled upon this strange case, and I wanted to know more about the woman at the heart of it. What I found was someone that probably needed a lot more care than she was provided, so bear that in mind going forward. The only thing I knew for certain about Lucille Silver was the information she gave to reporters when her and the Lyles first declared that the baby was the twin ray of Jesus. She said that her birthday was the 30th of March 1907 and that she was born in Bedford, Virginia. Now, date and location of birth in today's age can bring up a hell of a lot more than just an astrological chart, let me tell you. And it was this information that led me to discover so much more about Lucille's life, way more than I had even bargained for. She was indeed an inmate at Southwestern State Hospital, although I can't tell you exactly what years she was there. The only census that records her being an inmate is 1930, but as we previously heard, she was first admitted in 1927. The first time I could find Lucille using the last name Silver was in April 1929 in a newspaper clipping about her fainting during a court case. Apparently, she had threatened the life of a woman named Maria Venegas, who lived on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. The report claimed that Lucille had become belligerent following the loss of her job where they were both employed. Lucille said that she never threatened Maria's life and that she was merely bluffing. The case was ultimately dismissed and Lucille supposedly collapsed in relief. A police officer had to carry her down 3 flights of stairs, where she was revived by a matron and then released to go home. On the 1st of June 1929, she married a man named Wing Lee in Washington, D.C. He owned a Chinese restaurant on Pennsylvania Avenue. In September 1929, Lucille, using the last name Lee, claimed that a man named Samuel Wortlead had attacked her at the restaurant, although the only details I could find was this small newspaper mention. Apparently, a witness named Inez Chester fainted in court while she was giving testimony, and Wortlead claimed that he wasn't even at this restaurant when Lucille was allegedly attacked. Then, in October, Lucille Lee was on page 3 of the Washington Post. She'd been choked unconscious and punched in her left eye. She claimed that the perpetrator was a man named Joseph Sanson. The headline read, "Strangled Mother," and the Washington Herald ran a photograph of her holding a 4-month-old child that was supposedly hers. Remember, When Lucille spoke to the press in 1938, she said that she had a baby that had died. Part of me wonders whether this was the child that she was referring to. The next entry that I could find for Lucille under any name was on August 19th, 1932, and what follows is an incredibly bizarre set of circumstances. Now going by Lucille Silver, she was listed as being a 25-year-old nurse, and she had gone out for a ride with 2 men and a 14-year-old girl. That same night, her landlady had received a terrifying anonymous phone call, and a female voice had said,
Lucille Silver will not be home tonight. She's been murdered and her body was tossed on Riggs Road.
She was found less than a day later, lying on an embankment off of Conduit Road, south of Glen Echo, Maryland. Badly bruised and beaten, she was taken to Georgetown Hospital, where she told police that she was assaulted by 2 girls and 3 men. The girls held her down while the men beat her with a whip. She had between 15 and 20 welts on her right side and a slight bruise on her neck, and was described as being in a state of shock. The 2 men and the 14-year-old girl that she had gone out with were held in connection to the supposed beating. They claimed that they had driven to a house near Conduit Road for a party. They'd all been drinking and seemed to be having a good time, until Lucille suddenly grabbed her hat and coat and ran out of the building, screaming hysterically. The police managed to trace the phone call that Lucille's landlady had received to a store in the 1100 block of 12th Street, where the proprietor admitted to knowing Lucille, but also claimed to have not seen her or any of her friends for some time. The news article referenced a sister named Louise Rowlands, and through the genealogical work of Tommy Markham, I was able to confirm that Lucille did have a sister named Ellie Louise Leslie, who married Armand Harvey Rowlands in 1930 and used the name Louise most of the time. She mentioned that Lucille was involved in a quarrel with a young woman some time ago, potentially a reference to the court case with Maria Venegas. She also said that Lucille had divorced several years ago after her husband, a native of Ireland, had been deported. We know that Lucille was not married to a man from Ireland. She was married to an Asian man in the late 1920s. And I can imagine that it wasn't easy for either of them. When Lucille regained consciousness in hospital, she supposedly said, "They will kill me. Don't beat me. I'll do anything you say." She would later claim that she didn't know what the motive for the attack was, but that a woman had told her that she would get her, and that all of this had started over a baby. It makes me wonder whether this had something to do with the baby she was holding in the photographs in 1929, but it's impossible for me to say. When you compare the photograph of Lucille in 1929 and then photographs of her in 1932 after the beating, it definitely looks like the same woman. I'm 99% confident. As for the last name Silver, your guess is as good as mine. There's no record of her ever marrying someone with the last name Silver, so I genuinely have no idea where it came from. By August 21st, the police had dropped their investigation into Lucille's beating, claiming that she was unable to give a coherent account of what actually happened. She was reported as being indignant over what she believes to be the failure of authorities to act, and denied ever drinking that evening. She said that the account of her misadventures had been erroneous. Nothing seemed to happen. There was no further investigation as far as I can tell, and the newspapers just dropped the story. So I carried on digging and came across a strange article from September 10th, 1934 in the Evening Star in Washington, D.C. It was an account of how a 30-year-old woman named Mrs. Lucille Van Meter had attempted to take her own life by jumping off of the Taft Bridge. A passerby had found her clinging onto a rail by her fingers and pulled her back to safety, where she was taken to a nearby hospital. Now again, remember, when talking to the press in 1938, Lucille talked about an attempted suicide and a voice that told her not to do it. In that account, she claimed that her husband had died and that she had lost a child. And all of that could well be true. Perhaps Wing Lee did die just a short time after their marriage, and we know that she was at least photographed with a child. Now here's where it gets interesting. The article lists her as being the wife of a policeman, a Mr. Garrett E. Van Meter, who lived in Riverdale, Maryland. When Lucille went to adopt the baby from the city home in 1938, she used the name Mrs. Garrett E. Van Meter. And remember, the police called him and he claimed that he did not have a wife. He was like, absolutely not. But according to this account in the newspaper, his wife is named Lucille. The only thing is, I couldn't find a marriage certificate, but I did find an obituary for him in 1966, where his wife is again listed as Lucille. All I can think is that they may have separated between 1934 and 1938. Perhaps they were never officially married, or perhaps things had gotten rocky between them, so that when Garrett got a call from the press about Lucille, he was like, nope, never heard of her, and hoped it would go away. The only thing that gives me pause is that in 1934, Lucille would have been 27, not 30, but that could be inaccurate reporting. Everything else seems to point towards it being her. Another factor that points towards her being divorced or separated from Mr. Van Meter is that on the 12th of April 1936, I found a Lucille Van Meter Leslie listed as marrying a man known only as St. Baldwin in West Virginia. Now again, I can't find a copy of the marriage records to confirm that it's actually our Lucille, but less than 2 months later, she pops up again in West Virginia. This time she's going simply by the name Mrs. Lucille Van Meter, and she's listed as being 28. Technically, she should be listed as being 29, but again, it could be an error. The report claimed that she had been rushed to a local hospital after assailants had taken her for a ride and dumped her out of an automobile into the yard of a Mrs. McCulloch. They found a rope around her neck, said that she was suffering from strangulation, and that she was bleeding from the mouth. Now, this sounds somewhat similar to what happened to Lucille in 1932, but it's almost identical to what happened in December 1938, just before her court case against the Lyles. The story of her beating took the national press by storm, and the story was picked up by the Associated Press. They even linked her attack to the unsolved murder of a cab driver that same year. Luckily, they also printed a photograph of Mrs. Lucille Van Meter in her hospital bed, and when I compare it to the photograph from 1929 and the photograph from 1932, there's not much doubt in my mind that this is the same woman. The reports claimed that she had been hysterical since the attack and had been unable to give any detail. She was too ill for the police to question her, but it didn't stop them from speculating. She was listed as being an attractive blonde private detective, and the police believed that she was fearful of something or someone. One of the newspaper reports says that a sergeant learned that a short time ago, Mrs. Van Meter expressed a desire to break away from her associates and join the Salvation Army. A few days after being released, she gave some minor details about the attack. She said that she'd been accosted after departing a train, that one of the men said to her,
I saw you in the U.S. Commissioner's office the other day. How did you come out with that?
She claimed that the man in question followed her across a bridge and then forced her into a car with 2 other men. After that, she remembers nothing. According to one news report, several weeks prior, she had filed charges against 2 men she accompanied on a trip to Virginia, but these charges were never followed up on. I couldn't find any record of them either. So what the hell was going on? Was Lucille really a private detective? Was she assuming different names and identities? Just 1 month later, and there was another incident reported in the local West Virginia news. Lucille had been found again on the street with a rope tied loosely around her neck. The state trooper at the scene claimed that the rope was far too loose to cause her any harm, and there were no injuries. People started to doubt Lucille. They wondered whether these 2 incidents were publicity stunts, but Lucille stuck to her story. She said that she went walking with a man and could remember nothing after a few blocks. Then, in 1938, a few months after the twin Ray baby case had taken Richmond by storm, we have another attack that bears all of the same hallmarks. Lucille is found in a semi-conscious condition with a handkerchief in her mouth and a rope around her neck, and she claims that 2 men abducted her, drove around with her in the car, and then dumped her. What are the odds that this would happen multiple times? I tried to find more genealogical information for Lucille, and the research of Tommy Macon was incredibly helpful. He We actually tracked down this photograph of Lucille from 1940, where she's wearing what appears to be a nurse's uniform. Remember, in one of the reports of an assault back in 1932, Lucille is listed as being a nurse. My first instinct was to compare this photograph of Lucille Leslie with all of the other photographs that we have of her, and I think it's most likely the same woman. I crowdsourced some opinions from Twitter, and 69% of people agreed that it was too, but obviously I can't say for certain. The only other newspaper article I found for Lucille was in the Tampa Bay Times in 1959, where she was going by the name Lucille Van Meter. She claimed to have moved to Largo in around 1951 from Washington, D.C. And it's important to point out here that according to his obituary, Garrett E. Van Meter, the husband that denied he was her husband, also moved to Largo in 1951. The headline read, "Foster Mother Protests Loss of Children," and it detailed Lucille's sadness and frustration at having her 4 foster children removed because she was too far away from the clinic.
The welfare department telephoned Tuesday and came to remove all of my little ones on Thursday. Have you any idea how I feel? I love those babies.
It appeared that perhaps Lucille had become too attached, and it made me wonder whether these incidents throughout her life were due to some kind of trauma, like losing a child. I can't say for certain that the child she was photographed with back in 1929 was hers, but it would correlate with the latest story that she told, and it would explain her motivations for trying to adopt a child in 1938 and later becoming a foster parent. So what does it all mean? How come between 1932 and 1938 she reported 4 incidents of being attacked, all of them bearing almost identical hallmarks? I could put forward a ton of different theories about Lucille's life and these strange recurring incidents, but ultimately I'm left none the wiser. We know that she struggled with mental health in the early part of the 20th century. Mental health facilities in the modern day are sorely lacking, so I can't even imagine what it must have been like for a woman in the 1920s and 30s. We know that she experienced auditory hallucinations, and it's not really my place to speculate, but they could have played a large part in almost all of these bizarre events. Then there's the reports that she was engaged in some form of private detective work. She was in the Washington, D.C. area. It wouldn't be unheard of, and it may explain why she was targeted so many times, but there's not really much else to go on except for her word. And if she really was some kind of threat, then why did they spare her life in every incident? I don't have any definitive answers for what happened to Lucille, apart from an entry on findagrave.com that lists her grave at Oak Hill Burial Park in Florida. She died on December 19th, 2006. At the age of 99. She has another grave in the Greenwood Cemetery in Bedford County where she was born. It lists no date of death. The one thing that sticks with me is Lucille herself stating in 1932 that this had all started over a baby. My own research started with a baby, a supposed twin ray of Jesus, and led me to the complicated life of a woman who I still don't fully understand and probably never will. Chances are she'll most likely remain a mystery.
Thank you for watching the video, and also thank you to everybody that supports the channel on Patreon. Your contributions, even if it is just £1 a month, help to fund the research and creation of these videos. So if you want to support the channel, you can sign up today at Patreon for as little as £1 a month. See you in the next video.
Baby, baby.